Hello there. Chatbots and voice assistants are one of the most important tools in today's and especially in tomorrow's world. But who are the people that make them work? The conversation designers. My name is Eran Soroka, head of marketing operations for CoCoHub Conversational Components. Today, we have a special guest coming all the way from San Francisco, Dexter Zavalza, lead linguist and conversational AI designer at Deloitte Consulting. How are you, Dexter?
Hey, Eran, doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's a great honor. How did you get to conversation design?
Oh, it's an interesting story. I think everybody has one, right? I've heard so many of my colleagues give their sort of their narrative as well, and mine's similarly sort of roundabout, similarly indirect, and similarly a happy landing in the conversation design space. So, um, I ended up going the academic route and ultimately pursuing academic training in applied linguistics. It then ended up trending more literary through the PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. Obviously, being in the Bay Area, there was always an agency or a startup that needed somebody to write or to do some words things for them. So people started reaching out to me about, at this point, 10 years ago, asking for UX writing more than anything. Although, again, that discipline was sort of nascent at the time, too, relative to UX design. And that ended up turning into chatbots, simply people saying, I need you to write not just for screens, but for other types of interactions, right? Can you write something for this IVR flow that we have? Can you write something for a chatbot, things like that? And so I was doing conversation design in sort of a small scale for sort of bits and pieces here and there for people in my network without even realizing what it was as I was going through grad school. And then as I got more formal linguistic training and sort of worked in that space, I realized that there was a direct intersection between my training academically and then what I was doing in that space. And oh yeah, by the way, there's this whole discipline that's now emerging across the big tech landscape.
Okay, what is the bot or project you're most proud of?
Oh, geez. I mean, there's so many things. I think a lot of the things that I really enjoy working on most are sort of the fun pet projects. And actually, I'm going to sort of pivot your question a little bit too. So
Okay.
I think one thing that's been really interesting for me and something I've really enjoyed doing is picking up projects that are honestly pro bono for people that are in my network that just need the support of having either a good chat experience or a good voice experience to support what they're doing. For example, I really love museums, right? So in terms of sort of another question I'm sure is probably on your docket somewhere, how do you get into conversation design? Find a cause you care about, where there's an organization that has a limited or perhaps sort of scattered digital presence that has a real need for a voice interaction or has a real potential use case that's meaningful, and reach out to them and say, hey, I've got this expertise in building this type of experience. And again, that may be in the Alexa or the Google Assistant type space. It may be something completely different, but say, a museum, right? They're not going to have resources. They're not going to prioritize what their voice presence is going to look like necessarily within the Google Actions sort of catalog, right? And so you could just sort of reach out to those types of museums and say, hey, I've noticed you guys when I say, hey, Google, talk to, big city museum of art, what is the result I'm getting? It's Wikipedia. I can help you guys come and craft an experience that ultimately contributes to your brand, gives your visitors or your members some other value, and also helps me to build a portfolio in that space. So some of the projects I've done in that space have been in the surfboard industry and also in the museum space, is reaching out to folks and saying, hey, I noticed you guys don't have a voice presence. It's not really what I do full time. I work more in IVR and chat and other things, but hey, I've really got something I think that can contribute to what you guys are trying to do. Those are the types of things I really enjoy doing. Obviously, there are additional hours and, beyond the 40, 50, 60, whatever your work week looks like. But those are the types of projects I think a lot of us, in the creative space really derive the most sort of satisfaction from.
That's for sure. You're a big e-learning expert. Is there practices from there that you're using today in your current work?
Well, I think so. My work has sort of evolved rather quickly, right? I mean, so in the education space, when I was in higher education, so I obviously went through the grad school and sort of the terminal degree route, and then ended up teaching in universities and ultimately declining tenure track work to continue working in technology. I think that, beyond the e-learning piece or the instructional design piece, and I did have a brief stint at a big tech company as an instructional designer, writing scripts for a video-based curriculum. I think there's a lot of overlap there. E-learning is obviously very video based. And so any of the script writing that you may be doing in that space is ultimately going to contribute quite well to trying to really have a natural, coherent dialogue in language that users are both familiar with and comfortable with when engaging a voice-based bot or something of that nature. Beyond that, I think that, again, as you grow out of an individual contributor role and start to try to build out a conversation design practice at any enterprise, and again, this may be in any space and at any scale, really, I think a lot of the values and the background that former educators have is extremely valuable in the business space. And I spoke with many contacts recently, helped some people land some roles as well, many of whom were former educators. And I honestly, I targeted them to try to help them connect with people in my network because I understood that their ability to apply what they had learned or honed in front of a university classroom over many years was extremely valuable in terms of being able to command an audience, being able to make material extremely interesting, being able to communicate clearly and directly, being able to sort of set an agenda, run projects, run meetings in a way that was very efficient because they were used to doing that. And also just the sort of the empathy that they had for their students ultimately translated very directly to the empathy you would have for an end user, or client, or a customer. So I think that there's another piece of that too. I think people with a former background in education really have a lot to contribute to this space, in particular because it does align very directly with user-centric thinking, design thinking more broadly.
And on the other side, the coronavirus changed the e-learning for the foreseeable future. So how conversational AI can contribute both to the lecturers and the students?
You know, it's an interesting question. And even though you fed me these before we got on the call, I honestly haven't put a lot of thought into that. I mean, I think that there are certainly some platforms out there doing some interesting work. I've definitely seen some comments from my colleagues in my network who've gone through some of these sort of AI-driven e-learning experiences. And I think that there's a lot of potential there. I mean, there really is, in the sense that you can supplement a MOOC or a massive online open course or something of that nature very easily and very sort of seamlessly by integrating a good bot experience, whether that's text-based or voice-based. You could obviously give it another level of depth and another level of interactivity there that are going to sort of, potentially meet the needs or those use cases like the office hour question. And not just the sort of FAQ type office hour question, like when is my assignment due or how do I access this portal or whatever it is. But I think there's a lot of room to go deeper and really understand how you can build out flows that do allow for that back and forth, where the technology in terms of NLP and NLU will enable a true conversation that the user can feel that they are getting that deeper explanation that continues to drill down into topic matter, as you would if you were talking to a subject matter expert or a professor in some other context, right? So I think there's a lot of potential in that space. Admittedly, it's not something I'm focused on. Again, there have been many twists and turns in recent years in my career, but I do really think that there's a lot of interesting work to be done there.
Okay, from your broad experience, what is the most important thing for a chatbot, for a voice assistant?
Again, you've prepared me with the questions, but they're not easy ones.
Yeah.
I think, the most important thing really, and this is something that I would say across the board is essential, and we can't stop coming back to it enough. All of my much senior colleagues in the big tech world, and I'm really thinking and channeling here, honestly, the words and wisdom of Kathy Pearl, someone who I respect a great deal and whose work I've learned a lot from. But it's all about the use case. I mean, and obviously a lot of my colleagues and contemporaries are also saying the same thing, but it really is all about the use case. In the world I live in now, I think that there's the potential for someone to sell a solution that is conversational without necessarily having vetted a use case. And so I think it becomes even more essential as you get into different scales and different business models where you're trying to work with conversational AI, to always understand that what is the path of least resistance? What is the most friction-free experience that user can have? And that's really the question you have to ask going into the physical environment in which the user is going to be found, the other sort of coordinates around time of day and the things they're trying to accomplish. But you don't want to sell, and you certainly don't want to build a conversational experience when it could have been 2 taps on a screen to get there much more easily. And so in that sense, it's both the use case, but it's also once you've determined that the use case fits, it need to be hands-free, you need to be eyes up, you don't have the potential to necessarily engage in the same way, then how do you make it as minimalist as possible and get it as sort of straight front to back as you can, while still embodying the brand and the persona of the company itself.
Tell us about the funniest, the most surprising thing that happened to you while designing conversations.
Well, I think the funnest thing for anyone, I think, and this is consistent across many conversation designers, will tell you the first time they start reading the logs and trying to go in and understand when they're getting hit with emojis and curse words, right? Profanity. So obviously the first time you read the logs and you get a spout of profanity from a user, or you get a bunch of emojis that ultimately you can't necessarily translate as being the same as the curse word, right? It's even if you have emoji handling built in terms of Unicode and things like that, it's it's very subjective, right? Am I using the clown? What am I using the clown face for? Am I calling the bot a clown? Am I saying that was funny? Things like that. What does a pizza slice mean if someone throws a pizza slice? I mean, and say you're doing, filing insurance claims or servicing insurance claims. What does a pizza slice emoji mean there? So trying to work through those problems with developers and make sure that we can train models in a way that really account for both of those in a way that gives the user either the escalation they need because they've dropped an F-bomb on me, or trying to just reel them back in and give them some little Easter egg of a fun response, right? So bucketing out the decidedly positive, the decidedly negative emojis and saying like, hey, we've got a response for that. And giving them that little bit of delight, that delightful experience that will ultimately help the bot to stay alive in a moment when ultimately the user may have tried to actually kill the session by throwing a curveball.
Okay, besides finding a use case that appeals to you, what other tips or advice can you give to people who want to enter this field?
I would say, the way I always frame the conversation design field is that there are three, four, maybe five different permutations of identity that are sort of prevailing in this field. And I don't think anyone has to adhere to any single one of those, right? But you've got sort of you've got the two poles. You've got the writer on one hand, the script writer, the UX writer, the creative, and then somewhere in there you've got the UX designer who may not be language focused. And then from there, you've also got the hardcore developer, the person with a technical background who has an interest in being, they're able to build the experience, but they have more interest in being able to make it a more delightful experience as well. So it's where do you fit within those poles is sort of an important thing to understand when you're walking into interviews and when you're talking to people in the space. And so I'd say there are four or five sort of common permutations within that spectrum, but it's really identifying where do you really feel you are in that sort of in that range. Are you more pure script writer, pure creative, or are you more technical, or are you aspirationally technical by being stronger in sort of a more general UX space? If you are a UX designer who's just hoping to get more familiar or fluent in conversation design, where does that sort of position you as well? And so I think it really becomes a matter of personal branding in a lot of ways, and also understanding both where you are aspirational versus where you truly do have fundamental skills and skill set to offer to either an employer, a project, a client, or whatever you may be trying to negotiate to get that work on your resume.
Okay, Deloitte is a big company. You don't need an elevator pitch. What can you tell us about your area of responsibility, your key goals?
So yeah, as you know, confidentiality is an extremely important part of our reputation and the gravitas of who we are and what we do at Deloitte. So I'm going to speak at a very high level and not on behalf of my employees. But many enterprises are currently in the process of building out conversation design to ensure that there is that delightful front end experience for the user. And obviously, that connects directly to the client or the brand or the enterprise you're working on behalf of or with. Part of doing that is obviously finding the right people to staff a conversation design practice. And again, within that spectrum of users, the former UX designers or the current UX designers, rather, writers, creatives more broadly, and then developers as well, really trying to understand what all the talent pool that we have internally in an enterprise is, and also then trying to attract talent. That's certainly a fundamental part of trying to build out a conversation design practice more broadly. Therein, I think we also have to be very attentive to all the different channels which we may be wanting to use as designers and which our clients may be wanting to use as well. Or internally, if you're in an enterprise setting, right? What are all of those communications channels that you use to service your customers or to ensure that they have access to the resources they need to have the best customer experience possible? And to some extent, I think that a lot of that comes down to a philosophy of connecting customer experience with user experience and making sure that the business users or the business professionals in an organization are connecting their customer experience goals and KPIs directly back to user experience. So in building out any practice, again, at a high level here, I think it's about the getting the right people in the room, getting the right players on the field is sort of a poor metaphor, or the right maybe players of instruments in the orchestra, and keeping in mind that there's a lot of room to have people who are specialists in many different things doing that type of work. Obviously, someone who's written for IVR SMS is just as capable of writing for some other channel. Other folks who may have written strictly for screens but are just infatigable UX writers who really, really just have a craft and a sort of passion for the written word, and then converting that into the spoken or perhaps the chat-based experience, they're also going to have a lot to add. Certainly, having developers who are all about writing getting your webhooks in place and writing your APIs and getting everything going, that's essential too. So it's a big part of it, I think a lot of these enterprises right now in the work we're doing is making sure that at that sort of at that core level, we can both build out that discipline by having the right people in the space, understanding all the channels we're going to be working on, understanding all the use cases that and where they align to those channels, and then ultimately trying to really advocate for the necessity of having conversation design being a part of the process. We're sort of at a stage where I think UX design was probably decades ago, to be very honest. I wasn't in the space then, but where we still do have to fight tooth and nail at times for our legitimacy within the institutions and organizations where we work. And so, and that becomes even more important when we're pitching work to clients, whether you're an agency or startup or consulting firm. When you're working with clients, you have to budget for design as well. So I think it's people always want to know how fast can you get my solution live, but they don't take into account that if that solution goes live, but it's not a great experience, it's doing you more harm than it is good.
Yeah.
How do you ultimately advocate for conversation design, not only internally, but externally when you're in that sort of customer facing or client managing sort of role? So a lot of that intersects very directly with what we're doing at Deloitte. Very exciting times, lots of work going on in 2020 and beyond.
So thank you very much, Dexter Zavalza, a lead linguist and a conversational AI designer at Deloitte Consulting. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Eran. Hey, in my regards to Jason and Yaki, I think two of the biggest personalities, most fun people I've seen in the conversation design world. I really, really appreciate all the things you guys are doing with Coco. Keep it going. Can't wait to see where you guys go.
So for everybody watching, check out our marketplace at CoCoHub.ai, the best place to build and test and deploy your bot. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay cool. Bye-bye.